I am the inaugural director of the Ryan Institute at the University of Rhode Island, and we're doing actually a lot of really interesting research in Alzheimer's disease, as well as other neurodegenerative disorders, and I think this is a really exciting time to be an Alzheimer's scientist. One of the reasons why I came to Rhode Island from Texas is because of the environment here. We have a lot of wonderful partners with the University of Rhode Island. We have colleagues at Brown. We have colleagues at Lifespan. Brian Ott, who's at Rhode Island Hospital, of whom this lecture is named after, is just doing wonderful work. We have colleagues at Care New England, at Butler Hospital, Steve Salloway and his group, the VA Medical Center. So I think the ecosystem in Rhode Island is going to produce a lot of very important work in the area of neuroscience, and we're excited that the Ryan is a part of it. And I think your community has a lot to be proud of. I always say, since I moved here, it's a very small state, but it has a very big heart. And I think we're really doing wonderful things, exciting things, and more importantly, important things that I think will make a contribution to these terrible diseases. So I want to begin with a little overview to talk a little bit, explain to you how I'm going to organize my talk. And I know that I'm speaking to a pretty sophisticated audience, that some of what I'll say is stuff that I'm sure many of you already know, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I want to start kind of at the beginning and walk you through to talk a little bit about what is dementia, what is Alzheimer's, although, as I said, I'm sorry that some of you probably are all too familiar with what Alzheimer's is. Talk a little bit about the dementia statistics and where we are and where we're going, and why there's such a research imperative in trying to understand and prevent and cure these terrible diseases. Then we'll talk a little bit about the risk factors, because everybody wants to understand what their risk is for developing Alzheimer's. And here, I think this is an area where we could talk about some of the ideas that we have that potentially speak to preventative strategies. We'll also talk about the pathology of Alzheimer's, because that'll give us some insight as to how therapies have been developed that target some of the pathology. And in my opinion, some of the things that we do right in the research world, and maybe some of the things that we don't do so right. So I think it's important that you understand the whole picture, so that you understand where drug targets have been developed and where we hope they're going to go in the future. Then I want to spend kind of the bulk of our time really going over this idea of cardiovascular risk factors and how we think they play a role in the development of this disease. This has been an area that I've worked in for about 30 years, even though I know you think I'm very young looking. I'm actually not as young as you think. I've been doing this a very long time, and I think this is actually the most exciting time to be doing this, because it seems like a lot of work from around the world is now coming together to focus on this idea of cardiovascular risk factors, which to me is not only important as we think about developing treatments, which we scientists think about, but is also important as we talk about preventative strategies, which is, I think, what everyone needs to be thinking about. Because years ago, when I would give public talks and people would say, what can we do to prevent Alzheimer's? I think the answer was, well, we don't really know. There's really nothing we can tell you at this point in time. And I hope that by the end of our time together, you'll feel that what I've told you will give you some information about lowering your risk. That doesn't mean that I have the magic bullet, that I can wave my magic wand and say, you will not get Alzheimer's disease if you do everything I say, because that's not where we are at this point in time. There are still many questions that we have to answer, but I think it's hopeful that we have at least some answers today which say if you do certain things, you can lower your risk. So that, I think, is a very positive development. So that's how we're going to go through this. Typically, I like to have 3 or 4 hours to go through all of this, but I'm going to try and pick it up for you guys so we can be out in about 45, 50 minutes. So what is dementia and what is Alzheimer's disease? Sometimes people talk about dementia and Alzheimer's disease almost interchangeably, but that's actually not correct. Dementia is a general term, and it refers to sort of a group, it's a sort of a clinical term that refers to a group of symptoms where you have a loss of memory, a loss of judgment, language, complex motor skills, things that you used to be able to do that you can no longer do. That's not synonymous, it's not the same thing as Alzheimer's disease. Other conditions besides Alzheimer's can cause several diseases, including Alzheimer's cause it. Alzheimer's is the most common cause of it, but it's not the same thing. So dementia is the clinical presentation, and Alzheimer's is one of the causes of dementia. And again, as I was saying, there are a variety of other causes. Vascular dementia, things that relate to small strokes. There are other neurodegenerative diseases that can also give you a similar dementia presentation. Again, the dementia being the clinical picture. The important things, some of these things like normal pressure hydrocephalus and these other things, a few of these things are actually addressable clinically. So that's why it's important to get a diagnosis. But Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia. And again, it's this generalized terms, and it accounts probably for 60 to 80% of all dementia. Again, the clinical presentation of dementia, 60 to 80% of people that have dementia likely have Alzheimer's disease. So again, Alzheimer's disease is a progressive disease. It's an irreversible disease, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, about where drug therapies are now, what they can do and what they can't do. It is a disease that affects higher cortical function, memory, thinking. The risk of developing Alzheimer's increases with age, and after 65 is usually the peak age for the incidence of this terrible disease. Again, characterized by a loss of memory, a progressive, protracted course, which can vary in time. Some people can have Alzheimer's for a very long time. In others, the disease is more rapidly progressing. I'm sure many of you remember Ronald Reagan had Alzheimer's disease really for probably quite a long time. And it's variable from patient to patient. One of the concepts I like to get out early that I give in my science talks, and I like to give in the public talks, because I think it's an important concept. We talk about Alzheimer's disease like it's a single disease, but really it's not a single disease. It has, everyone who has Alzheimer's in the end has a common clinical presentation. Again, what is the clinical presentation? That's dementia. And if you have Alzheimer's, in the end, you have a common pathology, the neuropathology. When we look at the brain at autopsy, we see certain characteristic features. But having said that, the way that you get to that end, there are probably multiple ways you can get there. And that when we talk about Alzheimer's, it's likely to be a group of diseases. And that's important when we start thinking about treatments and how to deal with patients that have Alzheimer's, as we're getting a more and more sophisticated understanding of what this group of disorders represents. I think we'll be able to do a better job of treating people and understanding the development of the disorder. So again, memory problems occur and are typically one of the first early signs of Alzheimer's disease. So everybody, as they get older, if they misplace their keys, start thinking about, oh my God, you know, I have Alzheimer's disease. So changes with memory are very common when people get older. The analogy I like to use, and my daughter makes fun of me because she says that I'm old, that I even refer to the concept of a filing cabinet. People apparently don't have filing cabinets anymore. But I used to say that when you were young, your head was like an empty filing cabinet. And if somebody asked you a question, you could go, like for a name or a place, you could go right to that file and pull it up. When you get older, that filing cabinet is just full of stuff. So eventually you can pull it out, but it might take a little bit longer. So that's not memory loss that should concern anybody. When we talk about memory loss as it relates to Alzheimer's disease, we're talking about memory loss that impairs daily life. Something where it's not where you forgot where you put your keys, but you might have forgotten what your keys are actually for. It's a very different process, and I like to put that out there because people always worry about anything to do with memory. So there is something called mild cognitive impairment, which is a syndrome where patients have an impairment in their memory function, but they don't quite have dementia. So those of us in the science world are trying to understand. People develop this set of memory problems, and a percentage of those people will go on to develop Alzheimer's, but a percentage won't. So again, getting to this idea that there are a lot of different causes for Alzheimer's, there's probably a lot of different causes for MCI or mild cognitive impairment. As we start to understand what those things are, we can begin to understand what's causing the disease and ultimately, hopefully, to develop successful therapeutic strategies for it. So what you need to know about Alzheimer's disease, okay, it's not normal aging. And again, years ago, people used to say, well, you know, people, you just get old and that's what happens, and you lose your memory and you lose your brain function. That's actually not what happens. Alzheimer's disease is a disease. It's not normal aging. And it behooves all of us to start thinking in terms of how can we prevent this terrible disease, and ultimately how can we treat it for the people that are terribly affected. And again, as of today, I should go back, the Alzheimer's disease is listed as the 6th leading cause of death. It's actually probably higher as a contributing factor, but not always recognized as contributing to a cause of death. Again, so we've talked about what the disease is, which is a terrible disease for those who have it, for their families, those closest to them. But also as a society, Alzheimer's disease is a terrible disease because the burden, the economic burden on the United States and globally is huge. This slide talks about 5.4 million. I actually haven't updated it recently. I think it's actually a little bit higher now. And again, as we get to the age where we baby boomers hit the peak age for onset, the numbers are very scary. The amount that Alzheimer's will cost in lost wages, in caregiver burden, it's just mind-boggling. I mean, we talk about numbers that just, we can't even wrap our minds around it. 236 billion, this is just the United States. Then when we talk about the global society burden of Alzheimer's, it's just absolutely frightening. And particularly now when we start to think about Alzheimer's, it's going to impact even developing nations. The numbers really are really scary. And we talk about the fact that if dementia and Alzheimer's disease was a country, it would be the world's 18th largest economy. So we have a terrible disease that places an incredible burden on individuals and their families. We also have a terrible societal problem that says we must do something to, if not prevent this disease, delay this disease, do something, because the ability for Alzheimer's disease in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years to bankrupt our healthcare system is really, I think, is a very real concern. We've done, the medical and scientific community, I think, have done a wonderful job with a lot of other diseases. This is taken from the Alzheimer's Association's Facts and Figures 2011, showing the decrease in deaths from a variety of different causes: breast cancer, prostate cancer, stroke. I think we've done excellent work in educating the public and in looking for types of therapies that are successful. We have not made a dent in Alzheimer's disease. Again, when you think about it from the personal perspective, from the societal perspective, there's a huge imperative for us in the research community to find something for this disease. So let's talk a little bit about your risk, because everybody wants to understand what their risk is. When you think about risk, risk falls into two general categories. What we would consider non-modifiable risk factors, things that you can't do anything about. Okay, age. Age is the most important risk factor for developing Alzheimer's. Nobody's doing anything about that. I mean, everybody wants to live another day and grow old and healthy and happy. So age is a non-modifiable risk factor. Gender, for the most part, is a non-modifiable risk factor. And again, so women have a higher incidence of Alzheimer's disease, and they also have a high caregiver burden. Family history. You can't really do anything about your family, although some of you might like to as we approach Thanksgiving and other holidays. So we can't do anything about age, we can't do anything about gender, we can't do anything about family history. So what I put up here, the ApoE protein. So let's talk a little bit about the genetics of Alzheimer's. The genetics of Alzheimer's, the ApoE protein, so in the body, your body metabolizes cholesterol and other lipids. The way they move through your body, they're carried through this group of proteins called apolipoproteins. If you happen to have a type 4, there are 4 types of apolipoproteins. If you have type 4, you have an increased risk. That doesn't mean you're going to get Alzheimer's disease. People get confused when we talk about the genetics. People think, oh, well, you know, if my father had it or my mother had it. Yes, if you have a family history, you have a somewhat enhanced risk. But genetics as a determination of Alzheimer's, what we consider the genetic form of Alzheimer's disease, again, remember we talked about there are several different kinds of Alzheimer's. The form that we think is genetic is very small. It probably accounts for less than 5% of all Alzheimer's cases, which doesn't mean that your genes don't play a role, because for every disease, every person's genetic background is different. Mine is different than yours. Our risk for getting the flu, getting the common cold, everyone's genetic background plays into your predisposition. If you have E4, you have a higher risk of developing AD. That doesn't mean that you'll get Alzheimer's disease. And again, that's separate from this concept of genetic form of Alzheimer's, which we'll talk about in a minute, a little bit later when we talk about some of the prevention trials. So to understand the development of Alzheimer's, most people that get Alzheimer's don't have the genetics, for the form of the disease that we consider genetic. But it's possible that their genes contribute. When the ApoE4 was first identified, there was a big controversy. Several companies wanted to market this idea that you could test for E4, and that would tell people if they're going to develop Alzheimer's. And in the research community, there was a backlash to that because that's actually not true. You can develop E4 and have E4 and not necessarily develop Alzheimer's. So as a screening tool, as any kind of marker, it's really not useful, except from the science perspective, it gives us maybe a little clues as to what's going on. But in any event, my point is, you can't alter your genetics, you can't alter your age, you can't alter your family history, and you can't alter your gender. So what are the things that you can think about that you can alter and that you can affect? Well, let's talk about stress. Head trauma. Head trauma has been shown to be a very powerful risk factor for the development of Alzheimer's. Previous head trauma is an increased risk for a later development of Alzheimer's disease. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is this idea of the heart-head connection. The idea that what's good for the heart is good for the brain. That all the risk factors that have been identified for heart disease, high cholesterol, lack of exercise, homocysteine, all these noxious factors that we think play a role or that we know play a role in heart disease, we're pretty sure play a role in the development of Alzheimer's. And in fact, the Alzheimer's Association has, for a number of years, had this Maintain Your Brain campaign on their website. And that's essentially what the root of it is. Maintain Your Brain really is at its heart this idea of the head-heart connection. And when you think about it, the brain is the richest organ for blood, has the most blood vessels of any organ. It's only 2% of your body weight, but it's over 20% of your cardiac output. So the idea that what would go wrong in blood vessels would have something to do with what goes wrong in the brain in Alzheimer's seems to be actually common sense. And yet, in the scientific world, as we have examined this terrible disease for the last 30, 35, 40 years, this idea has not really been very well explored. And it's only now, in 2016, and I would say maybe the last 5 years, that there's an interest in trying to understand this heart-head connection. And why I'm excited about this is because this is, when we start talking about prevention, this is the area that we can focus on, because we know what are the things we can do to reduce heart disease. We can apply those same principles for reducing, again, our risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. Okay, diagnosing Alzheimer's disease. Diagnosing Alzheimer's disease in specialty centers, people like Brian Ott and others that know what they're doing in this world, can diagnose over 90% accuracy. Although today we still say that the definitive diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease is done at brain autopsy. But truthfully, if you go to a medical center where people are familiar, neurologists that know patients, that understand Alzheimer's disease, their ability to diagnose Alzheimer's based on their medical history, based on tests that measure cognitive function, based on ruling out other types of dementias, I think, and medical tests in blood and urine and spinal fluid, the ability to diagnose Alzheimer's accurately today is really pretty high. So let's talk about the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. And I think, again, that's important because this is where the research community has looked at the pathology of Alzheimer's and said, if we understood this pathology, meaning that at autopsy, when brains are studied by neuropathologists, people that examine brains, and they've defined a series of criteria that say this is what we see in Alzheimer's. The philosophy has been, if we understood how those things developed, we could develop drugs that would stop those processes. And I would say that as of today, we probably haven't been terribly successful. Again, I know this is a pretty sophisticated audience, and most of you are probably familiar a little bit, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But there are structural features that we see in the brain at autopsy for Alzheimer's patients. The presence of the neurofibrillary tangles, the presence of senile plaques, and the deposition of the amyloid protein. And again, I think most of you are familiar with this idea, and I'm going to show you a couple of slides. So again, the plaques and tangles. So the plaques of Alzheimer's disease, the senile plaques, are all areas where we have the amyloid protein that's deposited, this sticky protein that's deposited between cells and grows up in this sort of forest-looking area. Then we have the tangles, which are actually dead or dystrophic or dying neurons, nerve cells, and they have inside them this protein tau that we associate with the development of Alzheimer's. So you have amyloid in the plaques, you have tau in the tangles, and then we have another really pretty picture to show you again a high power of this amyloid protein, these fibrils. As you can see, these are 2 blood vessels. This protein is all around between these blood vessels. So people have looked at this Alzheimer brain and said there's a lot of amyloid and there's a lot of tau. So if we understand how amyloid and tau develop, that will tell us something about the disease. I might argue that maybe this wasn't really the way to approach this. The analogy I like to make, and those of you who have heard me speak before can sleep through this, but the analogy I like to make is if space aliens came down to Earth and they went to a fire, they would see firemen. And they would conclude that firemen start fires because they see firemen at the end. So in Alzheimer's disease, in autopsy, we see amyloid, we see tau, we see plaques. So they may be involved in the disease process, but they may not, or they may not be the whole story. I think that would be the take-home message from me today regarding these characteristic features. They're probably involved in some capacity, but they're not the whole story, and they have really been the focus of all research until recently in Alzheimer's disease. To me, the thing that's most important, in the end, people get dementia, people have loss of memory and impaired brain function because the neurons, the brain nerve cells, die. So again, with time, this is just numbers of brain cells to show you that when you get older, there's a little remodeling that goes on in the brain, so there is some loss of neurons, but nothing that's clinically important. But that in Alzheimer's disease, nerve cells die. That's the central issue. That's why people get dementia, and that's why you have Alzheimer's disease. So it seems to me the focus of our work should really be what is killing brain nerve cells. If we could understand that, then we could prevent that, we could treat that. That should be, in my opinion, the focus of what we're doing. And then I just have 2 slides to make that point. Again, you're looking at nerve cell neuron death. Alzheimer's brain here, normal. Again, look at the difference in size in the areas related to judgment, in the areas related to memory. Again, the Alzheimer brain versus the normal brain, language. So you have this death of nerve cells. You have the brain shrinking in areas that are important for higher cognitive function. So this is the central issue in Alzheimer's disease. So brain nerve cell death, that's the key. So I think most of us who work in this field would agree this is the key. So the $64,000 question is, how does that come about? And this is where I think there's a big divergence in opinions and hypotheses. And I would say that there's certainly probably more than one right answer here. I think there are a variety of different ways we get to the end. And again, what's the end? The end is nerve cell death. So let's talk a little bit about treatment and where we are and how we've come to this place in time with drug treatment. I would say, unfortunately, the research community has not done a good job in its drug development for Alzheimer's disease. Between 2002 and 2012, only 1 drug was approved by FDA, Namenda, in 2003. So the failure rate for developing drugs for Alzheimer's disease is over 99%. And the sad thing is, again, a lot of research effort has gone into this area, and you have to start to wonder why that is. It's not for lack of effort. It's probably because we've been very focused in the way we've approached this disease, which has, again, multiple causes. So the current drugs, none of the treatments that are available today are what we call disease-modifying drugs. They are all symptom-modifying drugs, which is not to say they don't have benefit. I think it's important that people get diagnosed early because these drugs are most effective in the early stages. And the way they largely work, for the most part, again, what did we say the central lesion is? Nerve cell death, right? That's what causes dementia and memory impairment. Well, before nerve cells die, they get sick. And the way nerve cells in the brain communicate with each other, this is a little inset to show you this place where the 2 nerve cells come together. One nerve cell releases chemicals, and it's these chemical messengers. This is the way nerve cells communicate with each other, is through these chemical messengers. So before nerve cells die, they get sick. and they make less of this messenger. So the drugs that are currently available for Alzheimer's disease, they don't stop the process of nerve cell death, but what they do is they artificially inflate the amount of messenger chemical you have in the brain. So even though your cells are sick, they still talk to each other pretty effectively. So they're very helpful, they're very useful, particularly early in the disease, but they don't address the central underlying pathologic process of nerve cell death, which is why in the later stages, they're not effective. The current drug targets for Alzheimer's disease, if you go on the Alzheimer's website and you just kind of casually survey the literature, there are quite a few clinical trials ongoing now. Again, that target, what are the two proteins that we talked about, the amyloid protein and the tau protein? There's several trials looking at solanezumab, which is a Lilly drug, and affects the level of this amyloid protein in the brain. Amyloid protein is made by two enzymes get together and help produce this protein, and this base is one of those enzymes, so there's some inhibitors for those. So again, some clinical trials focused on the amyloid. There's a trial, a vaccine trial, focused on lowering tau levels. And again, maybe they're involved, maybe they're not involved. As of today, I would say, in my opinion, there isn't definitive evidence that this is going to be a successful way to go, but we need to keep looking, and there are studies that are doing that. Inflammation, which is a little bit of what we're going to talk about today too. Inflammation is really the way a body responds. Your body responds to injury. If you cut your hand and it gets red, that's the way your body is trying to heal that wound. So there's a lot of data that says in Alzheimer's disease, inflammation goes awry, and the inflammatory processes are very high in the Alzheimer brain. So this is one of the trials that's addressing that. There's also an inhaled insulin clinical trial that's being run out of Wake Forest. There's some data to suggest that insulin, for reasons that we don't understand, the brain becomes insulin resistant, and this had some promising data that the inhaled insulin might be useful in some subcategory of patients. There are a variety of prevention trials. I'm not going to go into great detail, except again, the anti-amyloid treatment is about 1,000 patients that don't have symptoms. One of the things we're very interested in all these trials now is trying to get people earlier, because we think that some of the trials that haven't worked maybe because we're just too late in the process. So in this A4 trial, there was about 1,000 people who are asymptomatic, meaning that they have normal cognition, they don't have dementia, but they have high levels of the amyloid protein. So they're in this study to see if by lowering that protein, you can affect the development of whether they get Alzheimer's or not. The Tomorrow trial, again, looks at that ApoE protein, people that carry that 4, as well as 1 or 2 other types of genetic alterations, and follows them over time. Many of you may have heard of the Diane network, which is actually based up in Boston. Again, for those that have what we consider the dominantly inherited form, which, as I mentioned to you before, is a pretty minor form of Alzheimer's disease in terms of total incidence. But again, it might be helpful in trying to understand how these people develop Alzheimer's if they could be followed over time. So there are a variety of trials ongoing now. I want to bring us back to this idea of the cardiovascular risk factors in the development of Alzheimer's disease, because this, I think, is really where the public needs to start thinking about what they can do, and what we scientists need to think about how this might tell us something about developing therapies, how we could take this in a new therapeutic direction. Again, hypertension, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, high homocysteemia, all these conditions, lots of very convincing data say if you have high cholesterol in midlife, not in later life, in midlife, you have a greater likelihood of developing Alzheimer's. If you have hypertension in midlife, you have a greater likelihood of developing Alzheimer's in late life. So what does that say? That says that this is a disease that takes decades to develop, that the seeds of this disease are planted way early in life. And when we talk about lifestyle modifications and choices people make, it's important to understand that you don't start aging when you turn 65. You start aging the day that you're born. So it's important to think about the continuum of what happens from midlife to later life. And again, lots of data that says cardiovascular factors in midlife are linked to this development of cognitive impairment and dementia in late life. There was a study in France a number of years ago. I took this slide from their study, which I thought was really important. You know, we talk about risk factors, and then people say, well, you know, we already, you know, I have some, people already have problems, and they have some mental impairment, or they have the beginnings of Alzheimer's, so, there, it's too late, we can't do anything. They did a very nice study in France where they looked at people that already had some beginnings of cognitive impairment using the mental MMSE index of that. And they compared people that were followed over time to see how their cognitive function progressed. And patients that were not treated in any way, their cardiovascular risk factors were not addressed, proceeded to decline at this rate. Patients where some of the risk factors were treated were here. Those where all their cardiovascular risk factors were attenuated, were appropriately treated, were aggressively treated, performed much better over the time frame of the study. So for me, the take home of this study is that it's never too late to intervene. And even though we talk about prevention and the importance of doing things in midlife, even in later life, looking at these factors and things that we know impact the brain, it's important still to get the message out, which I think has not been heard, not only by the public, but I would say also by our physician colleagues, the importance of aggressively treating these vascular risk factors for improving quality of life and cognition. Okay, so we talk about the heart-brain connection. We're going to go kind of quickly through this. I love to show this slide because this is where I work, in the world of blood vessels in the brain. This is a cast of what your blood vessels in the brain look like to remind you that there are so many blood vessels in the brain. There's over 400 miles of blood vessels in your brain. And really, it's the job of these blood vessels to create the environment in which your brain nerve cells optimally function. So this was a procedure we developed years ago for isolating these blood vessels from the brain so we could study them biochemically. I'm going to go kind of quickly through this. And we've made two, I think, important observations. So normally I would take about 2 hours to talk about the next part, but I'm going to show you in 5 minutes some actual data from our lab. We did a study years ago that we published in about 1999 where we looked at brain nerve cell death. We took blood vessels from the Alzheimer brain, and we took blood, this was from post-mortem material. We isolated those vessels that I showed you, and we looked at how those blood vessels affected brain nerve cells in a dish, in culture. And we showed, if we looked at cell death, that the vessels derived from the Alzheimer brain were very potent in their ability to kill these brain cells, and that vessels isolated from people that were the same age, the same gender, did not evoke the same effect. So we thought this was a very significant finding because, again, what's the central issue in Alzheimer's disease? Brain nerve cells die. This says that blood vessels in the brain in Alzheimer's disease release factors that kill brain nerve cells. Then we published a series of papers where, again, not to bore you with all of this, to show that these vessels are making lots of different things, and all of these things are impacting the nerve cells, some of them in a very negative, toxic way. So we did this, and I'm just going to just focus on this one panel here to make a point. We looked in an animal model of Alzheimer's disease, which I'd be happy to talk to you a little bit later about that. Animal models are not perfect, but they do replicate some aspects of the disease. And we showed that if you looked at the Alzheimer's vessels compared to those from non-Alzheimer's derived animals, again, they were making all kinds of these noxious factors. If we gave them a drug, which has been developed for cancer, but has never been used in patients before for Alzheimer's, but targets, we think, as part of its action, the inflammation, the toxic production of these things in the blood vessel, we were able to show that by doing that, we could damp down the whole process. And the animals, which like like Alzheimer's patients, Alzheimer's animals develop memory impairment with time. And we were able to show not only could we prevent this expression of these terrible proteins, but that their memory actually improved. So that gave us this idea for a new way to think about Alzheimer's disease. In the end, the nerve cells die. And we think maybe they die because blood vessels get some sort of signal, make a lot of these terrible proteins, which then go on to drive some of the Alzheimer pathology. And if you could intervene in this step, if you could turn that signal down, you could perhaps make things better. And again, this is something that's never been done, has never been looked at, this idea of what we're calling vascular activation, which again gets back to me, common sense. We know things that affect blood vessels, cardiovascular risk factors, hypertension, high cholesterol, all injure blood vessels. Injured blood vessels make all these terrible proteins. If we could use a drug that could target that step, we might be able to make things better. We've done it in experimental animals. We'd like to do it in humans, and hopefully we're working towards that goal. And this is a little bit our scheme to show that, again, if you block this activated blood vessel, you could stop all the things that happen downstream that are bad for brain nerve cells. So again, the process of discovering drugs and just testing them takes years and is very expensive. What we like about our approach is we're looking at taking a drug that's already approved for something else and repurposing it and testing it in Alzheimer patients. And there's actually a lot of interest now, I think, in this idea of repurposed drugs. Let's take drugs that are out there that might have a different mechanism or a different target where people haven't looked and test it in Alzheimer's patients. Why not? Which brings us to the prevention piece. And I'm going to do this pretty quickly, but I think we've talked about this throughout my talk. This idea, again, what do we know about heart disease? What do we know? What are the things that people need to think about? Well, it's all the things that we talk about, but we never really actually like to do. Diet and exercise. Exercise. So the idea that exercise can affect the brain, we've known for many years that there is some connection of exercise and higher cognitive function, but it's really only been in the last couple of years that I think this link of exercise and brain function has been really pretty solidly shown, both in experimental animals and in humans. This idea that you could improve cognition through physical activity is a very powerful tool. We had gone to the Alzheimer's International meeting in Toronto about a couple of months ago, and some studies were presented there. The amount of improvement that people showed in that study from exercise was better, more powerful, larger than anything I've ever seen from a drug study. So again, I don't think exercise gets the amount of airtime, I would say, that a lot of the drug studies do. And sometimes the study is performed and people will say, well, we did this exercise trial and nothing happened. So everyone's quick to say, well, exercise doesn't do anything. But the reason why I think some of those trials have been negative, and the data that was presented at that meeting, I think shows that you have to be very sophisticated in how you think about exercise. You have to have a certain amount, a certain intensity. You have to understand what you're measuring. If you're measuring memory, maybe it takes a certain amount of time to see an effect. If you're measuring executive function or decision making, that might be a different time frame. So I think doing an experiment where nothing happens with exercise, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I think for the most part, there's much more data that says we really need to start thinking and getting the message out that physical activity has a profound effect on cognition. Again, so I think the exercise your body, lots of very solid data. This idea of exercising your brain, things like luminosity and doing crosswords and other things, I would say that that's all sort of anecdotal and interesting. There really isn't a lot of hard science that says you should definitely do this. But on the other hand, I don't see a downside, and it actually makes sense when you think about it. You're stimulating your brain in some capacity. I think some studies have shown that by doing the luminosity, you get better at doing that, but maybe that doesn't translate to better skills in other things. So I think the jury's still really out as to what some of the mind-enhancing computer games do. But my feeling is there's really nothing wrong with doing it, and it likely probably has some benefit, although we don't have anything that we can successfully measure and say for sure, like we do for exercise, where we know that's important. Again, staying socially active. I think those kinds of experiments aren't really done, but we have anecdotal data, epidemiologic data, that suggests that people that have more social interactions, more community connections, whether it's through family or church, do better than people who are isolated, particularly as they get older. So again, I think the things that are easy to do, that don't cost anything, that might be of some use, I would say why not? And the thing that we know is important, the exercise that's relative to your fitness level is something that I would really encourage. Then we get into the subject of diet. And again, most people don't want to think about diet because You know, I came here from Texas, so we all know about meat and Mexican food and all the really bad stuff. But again, a lot of controversy about diet, and why is that? It's hard sometimes to do these experiments and get that cause and effect relationship. But I would say surveying a lots of the epidemiologic studies, the weight of evidence suggests that this Mediterranean diet, and again, I think all of you know what that involves, you know, less red meat, less processed food, less, you know, refined foods, less sugars. Again, we don't have, I can't say if you eat this food for sure you won't get Alzheimer's, but the idea that we know this is important for heart health, and we are pretty sure that it's also important for brain health. So I think it's important to get this message out, and I feel that we haven't done a good job as a research community in getting the word out. This is the one that I like. Everyone boos. They boo about the diet and they boo about the exercise, but everybody likes the wine slide. So, and I, in all disclosure, I did have a glass of wine when I got here. So, and again, not that I'm suggesting that you guys all run out and have a bottle of wine, but there's been, I think, again, most evidence suggests that moderate consumption of alcohol, particularly red wine has resveratrol, which is a potent antioxidant in the skin, which is in the skin of the grape. So red wine has a lot of it because red wine sits with the skins a long time, which is why it's red. But even white wine has some resveratrol as well. Again, a lower incidence, all based on association. There's no direct cause and effect, although there's actually quite a bit of data looking at resveratrol itself as a potential antioxidant in Alzheimer's disease. But again, as part of this whole picture of a healthy diet, that moderate alcohol consumption, moderate wine consumption, we think is a benefit. So, the ways to maintain your brain, again, it all starts with this idea of heart health. Eating well, exercising, and from the research community, trying to understand how all this develops and how we as scientists are thinking about ways to treat patients that have this terrible disease by thinking about this. But I think for the general public, understanding that we can do things to lower our risk, and we should do things, and we should get that word out to younger and younger and younger people to say that you can take charge of your health, you can reduce your risk, that when you get older, you won't have Alzheimer's disease. Again, exercise, good diet, maintaining cholesterol levels, doing all the things that we know. Think of what's good for the heart is also good for the brain. So with that, I'd like to leave you with this idea that I think there's a lot of hope. There are a lot of people all over the world working on these terrible problems. And I think as we're learning more and more, and the technology just grows by leaps and bounds every day, we're doing a lot of exciting things here in Rhode Island, a lot of exciting things going on. I think there's really a lot of hope for the future. So with that, I think I'll stop. Thank you.